Hello, everybody, and thank you for choosing to attend the presentation on KSync, that is a kernel-based framework to convert synchronous read I/O to asynchronous I/O. On the very outset, I would want you to reflect upon the progress that we made in the storage technology in the last decade or so. 2000 was the time of hard disk drives. A disk I/O used to take around 10 milliseconds time to complete a single round trip. The operating system overhead or the software overhead for this I/O was around 10 microseconds, which was negligible in comparison to the total round trip I/O taken by the hardware. Fast forward a few years to SAS triple layer cell, NAND SSDs, and we made a drastic improvement in the hardware round trip times. Now it takes 80 microseconds to complete a round trip I/O. The operating system overhead was still 10 microseconds. It had started to show up. We made a lot of changes to operating system infrastructure and the system software, also the bus protocols like NVMe. We also changed access to user space access methods, which allowed us to cut the overall software overhead to around 5 microseconds. This was a good improvement. As you all know, that the hardware typically stays ahead of the software technologies by a long shot. So improved memory technologies like 3D XPoint and other hardware innovations like storage class memory allowed us to complete this I/O in 2 microseconds, whereas the software latency was somewhere around 5 microseconds. This meant that for each I/O, we lost time to do 2 more I/Os. The situation was almost similar even for remote memory. Very fast storage protocols like NVMe OF and the drivers, the new storage hardware, to allow access to this remote storage allowed us to read this storage in almost 6 microseconds. Now 5 microseconds was a time that was still noticeable in our software stack. Well, that was all about the storage speeds, but no matter how hard the hardware is, how fast the hardware is, it always matters how do we access the storage devices. So let us analyze 2 different methods of accessing storage devices: synchronous I/O and asynchronous I/O. Synchronous I/O, as the name suggests, happens synchronously, which means the next I/O always succeeds the previous I/O. Asynchronous I/O can happen at the same time. Now let us take an example of synchronous I/O. We issued I/O1, which took 15 seconds. Upon its completion, another I/O was issued, which took 2 seconds. Thereafter, another I/O, which took 5 seconds. And at last, we took 3 seconds to complete our last I/O. You see that the total time taken by all these I/Os is somewhere around 25 seconds. For asynchronous I/O, we could have issued all of them together. And the time taken for asynchronous I/O cumulatively would be the time taken for the largest I/O, which is 15 seconds. Now, this can be perceived as a big improvement. So sometimes we think, why don't we always use asynchronous I/O? If asynchronous I/O is so much better for performance, why not use asynchronous I/O all the time? Well, in the age of HDDs, I/Os was done to a disk with rotating platters. We had to move the head to the right block and the right sector to perform the I/O. It was not possible to perform another IO while the disk arm was busy with your previous IO. So there was no question of parallel IOs. There is no such constraint for an SSD. As you can see in the picture, an SSD has got an array of memory chips, and each of them can be accessed individually. The mediums are not rotating platters anymore. These are individual cells which can be addressed individually. So all in all, if we talk about storage, so in previous generations, we solved three major issues with storage, right? And I would want you to remember this, because we are going to talk about it more in the later part of our slides. The major problem with storage is that storage is small, storage is slow, storage is unreliable, and storage is only allows serial access. So most of our enterprise systems solve these three basic problems. Sometimes they group disks in an array to allow parallel access and hide the speed issues. Sometimes they create redundancy by mirroring RAID, etc., right, to mask its unreliable nature. Sometimes we scatter data to multiple physical devices to allow parallel access. With the current storage infrastructure, it does not make sense to use synchronous IO any further. Well, now let us see what are the current methods and the most popular methods of doing asynchronous IO. One of the most popular method of doing asynchronous IO is poll select. That is followed by ePoll. ePoll is just a modernization of poll select, where you can watch multiple file descriptors at the same time. Another popular method of doing asynchronous IO is IO Uring. This was very recently introduced in the Linux kernel and has gained popularity very, very soon. So let us look at each of these methods in detail. Suppose you want to use poll select to do asynchronous IO. The application first sends a system call doing a kernel context switch, asking to read a certain block in the storage device. The kernel initiates the IO. And if the kernel decides that it cannot really satisfy the IO request at this time, it returns with E again, or E would block. The application will then have to block with either select or a poll call, which basically blocks until that IO is ready. When the read response actually arrives in the kernel wakes up the blocked select thread or the poll thread and notifies the process that your IO is ready to be done at this moment. Application performs another read system call and copies the data back to the user space. Well, that was all about async IO using poll select. When we use ePoll, almost the same method is used. The only difference is that you can watch multiple file descriptors doing asynchronous IO at the same time. Let us discuss another popular strategy of doing async IO, which has recently gained a lot of traction in Linux. IO Uring. So IO Uring is a relatively new technology where the kernel shares two basic data structures with the user space, a submission queue and a completion queue. The application asynchronously adds work to SQEs, or it adds work to the SQ using SQEs. SQE is basically a submission queue entry. It has all the information regarding that IO. And the application potentially queues a lot of them before it notifies the kernel that it has got some IOs to perform. This can be done using multiple methods. Either the application can do a system call, or it could update a memory mapped register with the kernel. The kernel posts CQEs on completion. A CQE is a completion queue entry. And it can likely post a lot of them. It is the application's responsibility to independently poll for completions. There are no notifications provided in IO_URIN method. So as you can understand, an application has to decide that what are the IO operations that it can do, and perhaps loop through other important work while the IO is not available. When the IO becomes available, it has to have the logic to utilize them. And if in a poll loop it finds that IO is still not available, it still needs to find some useful work to do. As you can understand, coding this kind of asynchronous IO is not straightforward. Now that we have discussed asynchronous IO and synchronous IO, do you really spot the obvious issues? Even though you have an infrastructure to do async IO, the application needs to be aware of the IO model. The application needs to have several threads of execution, some block for completion while other continue useful work. Typically, you can also perform asynchronous IO with a single thread, but it will be very difficult to do some useful work without having multiple threads of execution. Legacy applications need to be redesigned and recompiled. Of course, there were a lot of legacy applications which were already written before we had any of this asynchronous IO infrastructure available to us. For a very large application, this typically means substantial cost of development and testing. And even though we are ready to incur these costs, it still might not perform like the older application used to. This is a major challenge for the enterprises. Now that you know that what are the issues of doing asynchronous IO to older enterprise applications, let us ask, what if we could perform asynchronous IO without changing any application logic? Wouldn't it be magnificent? What if we could do asynchronous IO without introducing any threads? That would take away a lot of complexity. What if we can do asynchronous IO without recompiling the program? That would avoid a lot of costs. So introducing kasync, which is a kernel method to convert synchronous read IO to asynchronous IO. As you see, we are basically emphasizing on synchronous read IO. There are other methodologies to speed up write IOs, and I think you already know about them. They are, they are caching. So caching is one of the most efficient ways to speed up write IOs. In this presentations, we are going to specifically focus at a mechanism to speed up the read IOs. Let us look at a sample application. You see, our sample application, as soon as it starts, reads a lot of config data. Then it reads a lot of other data. It goes through a lot of app logic, which might have nothing to do with the actual buffer that it read at the beginning of the program. Neither it may have anything to do with the second buffer that it read at the beginning of the program. And this logic can span, from a few lines of code to 1,000 lines of code. You would be surprised that this pattern is almost found in almost all big enterprise applications which were written 10 to 15 years ago. Finally, our application goes and analyzes, these two buffers for doing any sort of analytic work. In some enterprise applications, we have seen that a buffer that was read before was never read back in the entire program. The buffer is only used upon some conditional statements, which sometimes might never even happen. Well, there is an opportunity to optimize this kind of situation, and that is exactly what kasync does. Let us look at the method how kasync operates. An application makes a system call. The kernel identifies the virtual address of the buffer supplied for this read and basically sets a trap on access on this buffer. This can be done using multiple methods. Some hardwares do allow facility where you can actually set a trap on a certain physical page on access. On certain hardware where we do not have this kind of capability, this buffer can be unmapped and IO can be initiated to some other buffer. Upon completion, the actual physical page can be remapped to this virtual address. Going forward, we actually issue the IO and submit a submission queue entry to the device drivers. We return back to the application saying that the IO was successfully completed. When the actual IO response arrives, we go ahead and restore the page property. Now it is possible for the application to go ahead and access this buffer again. IO response received unset the read-only bit or whatever else mechanism it has done to set that trap. Let us look at a more interesting situation. The application makes a system called to perform a read IO. The kernel sets a trap on that virtual address. The page corresponding to the buffer is set to execute a trap on access. We issue an IO by submitting an entry in the submission queue. We return back to the caller saying that IO was complete. Now let us say the application immediately reads this buffer or accesses this buffer. IO is not complete yet. The trap is executed and the process is brought to a sleep. When the actual IO completes, the buffer page properties are restored, application is put back to the run queue. If it still has the right privileges, it can even acquire the CPU, and the process is allowed to proceed ahead. Now, you may have a doubt that when access to this virtual address was not allowed, how did the hardware actually write all the IO data back to the same page? Since the physical page has properties set to trap, any access to that address by the host will cause a trap. Well, the device memory access does not go through the MMU and is able to write to the physical frame without hitting the trap. The access to that page, the host access to the page only goes through the MMU, which is basically set up to execute the trap. Well, this was the basic method of performing k-async in the kernel. Well, now that we understand k-async, let us see when can we use this technology. Of course, you must have guessed by now that this should be implemented below the caching layer, when we are absolutely sure that this IO is going to go to the actual device. We actually analyzed a lot of applications and we found that it is going to be very, very useful for old data warehousing workloads, tactical business analytic workloads, which was probably written 10 to 15 years back. A lot of old games, a lot of old analytical applications. It specifically helps single-threaded legacy applications that does a lot of reads. It will also be helpful to a lot of applications which does batch data loading. Well, we talked about how we are going to implement KSync, but we didn't actually talk about what happens, in the condition where the application actually has logic to process all kind of error recoveries. Typically, we find ourselves in a catch-22 situation. In a normal application, we see a pattern like as soon as the read is done, the application has a logic which basically checks the return code and makes sure that IO was done successfully. In our case, we'll find that this IO was successful, although the IO is not yet even complete yet. So we are bypassing the application's error recovery or error checking mechanism. But I would want you to just recap the first couple of slides that we talked about. This kind of code was actually very necessary when we were dealing with the hardware, which was slow, unreliable, and allowed serial access. But one of the properties of these devices have changed. These devices very seldom cause errors. And even in the in the condition where an error may really happen, we propose some mitigations. We basically propose sending a signal to the applications whose default action is to kill the app. Now, it is also possible that the application can be instrumented to install a signal handler, which can be given an opportunity to course correct. It is possible to patch a signal handler and without actually changing the logic of the program. So when a condition like this arrives, and maybe the application has not even touched the buffer, and the signal handler is invoked, and we already come to know that this IO has failed, the application might gracefully exit, or it can understand that this IO has really failed, and it can actually log helpful error messages for the administrators to course correct later. Let us also talk about the KSync performance gains. So we actually tested KSync with a lot of old enterprise workloads, and we saw a great improvement with a lot of workloads which were old, legacy applications, mainly running with single execution context. We saw almost 5 to 15% improvement in the net execution time. We must confess that the single threaded legacy application showed the best performance gains. Now, since we talked about all these gains, we should also tell that it is not suitable for all workloads. If a workload that immediately consumes the read after just performing the IO may have to pay the penalty of an extra trap, causing loss of performance. We observed some optimized applications having performance degradations of 2 to 6%. So basically, KSync is not a solution which fits all, but it definitely gives a big performance bump to a lot of old enterprise applications. With that, we conclude our presentation. Please take a moment to rate this session, and your feedback would be very important to us. Do contact us on our emails and in the chat session if you have any doubts or any other feedback about our session. Thank you for taking the time once again to attend this session. Thanks again.